Welcome back to another deep dive here on Green Dolphin Science. You've brought us some really fascinating and maybe a little concerning research this time. We're diving into a pretty comprehensive look at neonicotinoids. You know, that class of insecticides that's become so prevalent globally, and we're specifically focusing on their presence across China's environment.
Exactly. These chemicals, they're used incredibly widely, and given China's scale both in agriculture and, well, pesticide use overall, understanding where they're showing up there is absolutely crucial. The material you've shared really pulls together a broad picture of this.
Okay, let's unpack this then. It sounds like these neonicotinoids, or neos, I guess, are pretty much everywhere in China. Soil, water.
Even the air, yeah.
Right. So our goal today is to get a clear handle on this. What are the big, maybe surprising takeaways from this research that you think we should really focus on? We want to make sure this deep dive leaves you feeling informed, maybe with some aha moments, and not just, lost in all the data. So maybe let's start at the beginning for anyone just tuning in. What exactly are neonicotinoids?
Right, good place to start. Neonicotinoids, or NOs, are a class of insecticides. They've become incredibly popular in, well, modern agriculture. Think of it in terms of how we've controlled pests over the years. They came after other major classes like organophosphates and pyrethroids, and they're really effective against certain types of pests, especially sap-feeding insects, things like aphids and whiteflies that can do a lot of damage.
And their use is global, right? Not just specific to China.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. They're registered in, I think, over 120 countries. And back in 2014, they actually made up about 25% of the entire global pesticide market. That's huge. Now, when we zoom in on China, which is our focus here, it's the world's top consumer of pesticides overall. So you've got this massive amount of cultivated land, huge demand to protect crops. It makes sense they'd be used heavily there. China isn't just a user, it's really a global epicenter for NEO use.
Okay. So when did these first start showing up in a big way in China's farming practices?
Well, the first generation really took off with imidacloprid, often just called IMI. That was back in 1991. Then, between roughly 1995 and 2002, there was a kind of surge of newer ones, what we call second-generation neonicotinoids. These include names like nitinpyram, acetamiprid, thimethoxam, or thymclothianidin, thiacloprid, and dinotefuran. So, yeah, a clear progression.
A global trend with these key chemicals emerging, but the research also mentions some even newer ones developed in China and primarily used there. That's where it gets really interesting, I thought.
Yes, exactly. That's a crucial point. It really highlights China's unique role here. They've independently developed their own sort of next generation of NEOs. We're talking about compounds like imidacloprid, cycloxiprid, guadapur, and cycloxylidin. Quite a list. What's significant, like you said, is that for now, these seem to be primarily used within China. They haven't been widely registered in other major agricultural areas like, say, the U.S. or the EU, which definitely raises some interesting questions about their specific properties and impacts, maybe unique to the Chinese context.
That is fascinating. So they're innovating, not just adopting. Now, their research also brings up some pretty serious concerns about these chemicals, both the established ones and these newer types. What makes neonicotinoids, well, a worry for the environment?
The concerns really boil down to a few key characteristics they tend to share. They're generally hydrophilic, meaning they dissolve in water pretty easily, and they also tend to persist. They don't break down quickly in the environment. And that combination, the water solubility and persistence, is what leads to potential ecological risks. Because they're water soluble, they can move around easily, through rain, waterways, and because they stick around, they can have longer-term effects. We're talking potential harm to non-target beneficial organisms, pollinators like bees, obviously, but also birds that eat insects, earthworms in the soil, fish.
And that link between neonicotinoids and the decline in bee populations is a really major worry, isn't it?
Absolutely. There's a significant body of research now connecting NEO exposure to declines in bee populations. And that's concerning because, well, bees are vital pollinators for so many of our food crops. The decline impacts food production, biodiversity. What's also worth noting from the research is that some of these newer generations developed in China might actually have increased toxicity. For instance, guadapur showed high toxicity to silkworms and honeybees in some studies, and others like cycloxiprid, paichanding, and imidacloprid showed lower LC50 values in zebrafish.
Lower LC50 values. Okay, break that down for us. What does that mean in simple terms?
Sure. LC50 is basically a measure of toxicity. It stands for lethal concentration, 50%. So it's the concentration of a substance in, say, water that kills half of a test population, in this case zebrafish, over a specific time. A lower LC50 value means less of the chemical is needed to cause that level of harm. So indicates higher toxicity. These newer NEOs might be more potent, essentially.
Right, more potent. That's definitely concerning. And it's not just about the environment, is it? The research also points to potential risks for human health.
Yes, that's another layer. Because these substances can potentially enter our bodies through diet residues on fruits, vegetables, that sort of thing. The research highlights potential chronic health risks. Things like hepatotoxicity, liver damage neurotoxicity, affecting the nervous system, genotoxicity, which is damage to DNA, and even endocrine disrupting effects, messing with hormone systems.
Okay, so widespread, persistent, potentially harmful across the ecosystem, including us. Right. Let's dig into where these are actually coming from in China. The research breaks it down agricultural and urban sources. Given China's huge agricultural output, let's start there.
Yeah, agriculture is definitely the primary source of neonicotinoids getting into the environment in China. As you said, the country has just vast cultivated land. Corn and rice make up the largest chunks of that. And what's interesting is how the insecticides are applied differs quite a bit between these crops, which affects where they end up.
Okay, corn and rice, the big players. How are NEOs used on them? Let's take corn first.
For corn, the main methods are treating the seeds directly, either coating them or mixing the insecticide in before planting. Thimethoxam, Thym, and clothianidin, CLO, are common for this. And corn planting schedules vary too, once a year up north, but maybe twice down in the southern tropical areas, so potentially more applications there. Research shows neo concentrations in corn fields tend to increase in the first, say, 5 weeks after planting, especially after rain. There's even data showing Thym can get down 30 centimeters into the soil within just 8 days after sowing with seed treatment. That's pretty fast movement downwards.
That is quick, 30 centimeters in 8 days. Wow. Okay, what about rice? That's a totally different system, paddy fields, lots of water.
Exactly. Rice farming relies more on pesticide sprays, often a heavy application right at the start of planting to deal with pests that survive the winter, like stem borers or plant hoppers. Dinyl is a main one used in rice paddies, and the research points out pretty high concentrations measured in the water running off rice fields, especially in areas like the Poyang Lake region. The application cycle is really tied closely to the rice growth stages.
And the way these sprays are put on the technology, the efficiency, that must play a role too, right? And how much actually ends up drifting away.
Absolutely. Traditional manual spraying is still really common in China, holds a big market share. The problem is the utilization rate, how much pesticide actually hits the target plant, can be pretty low, often less than half. So a lot can drift or just end up on the ground or in water. And while drone spraying is increasing, trying to be more efficient, there's still potential for drift and unintended spread, even with that tech.
Okay, so agriculture, clearly a major pathway. But what really surprised me in the research was the significant contribution from urban areas. Seems counterintuitive.
It might seem that way at first, yeah. But think about the push for urban greening parks, lawns, gardens in cities. These areas actually turn out to be the second largest non-point source of neonicotinoids. The research states, and this is pretty startling, that pesticide use per unit area in urban municipal pest control can be up to 10 times higher than on agricultural land.
10 times higher per area. Wow. So our efforts to green cities might be creating these little chemical hotspots.
It seems that way, yeah. And it's not just lawns and parks. They're also commonly found in household pest control products, ant baits, cockroach traps, fly sprays, that sort of thing. And even in wet products for pets, like flea and tick treatments. Urban green space has expanded dramatically in China over the last couple of decades, and with that comes managing pests on ornamental plants, aphids, scale insects. They're common targets for NEOs in cities. Interestingly, studies found higher soil concentrations after spring pest control in parks compared to autumn applications.
So even treating the dog or planting flowers contributes. What about wastewater then? Sewage from cities.
Yep, another important pathway. NEOs from pet treatments, gardening runoff, household products, they all end up washing down the drain into urban sewage. The challenge is, conventional sewage treatment plants, the activated sludge process and so on, they aren't very good at removing these compounds. Some might get absorbed onto the sludge, but that could be temporary. They might desorb later. So studies have found NEOs like IMI, in the treated effluent, the water being discharged after treatment. Even wastewater from food and beverage processing can be a source.
Right. So this paints a picture of really widespread use, not just out in the fields, but right where people live. Okay, let's shift to where these are actually being detected in China's environment. Water, soil, air. Let's start with water. What's the picture there?
Well, they've been detected in a really diverse range of water environments across China. Levels vary hugely from non-detectable right up to quite high concentrations. though most measurements seem to be below, say, 100 nanograms per liter. Research so far has focused quite a bit on inland rivers, especially in the more developed south, east, and central regions, think Yangtze and Po River basins. But there are still big gaps. We need more data on smaller watersheds, the southwest region, and there's very little research on marine environments or groundwater.
Are there specific areas or types of water bodies that seem, worse off than others?
Yes, definitely. Urban river sections consistently show higher concentrations than rural ones. Cities like Beijing, Guangzhou, areas near Taihu Lake, they've reported some of the highest average concentrations. That really points to the impact of residential use in urban green spaces. Overall, eastern China's surface waters seem significantly more contaminated. We also see some specific hot spots, like very high concentrations found in the Kilo Lake Basin in Yunnan, especially in summer. And often, concentrations tend to increase as you go downstream in rivers, likely due to pollutants converging from cities, though they can decrease further out due to degradation and adsorption.
Makes sense, yeah. Accumulation downstream. What about seasonal changes? More in the rainy season, maybe?
Exactly. Detection levels tend to be higher during the rainy season compared to the dry season, likely due to increased runoff washing these chemicals from fields and urban surfaces into the water. It's also possible they're applied more in dry conditions when plants might not take them up as well, leading to more being available to wash off later.
Okay, let's move from water to soil. What about neonicotinoids in the ground? I imagine they might not move as easily as in water, but could stick around longer, accumulate.
You're right on both counts. They can persist in soil for quite a while, potentially years in some cases. Studies in older citrus orchards, for example, found they'd reach deeper soil layers. So, less mobile than in water, maybe, but that longer retention time definitely raises concerns about accumulation over time in the soil ecosystem.
And do we see the same kind of regional differences in soil contamination across China?
Absolutely. The levels vary hugely. Some of the highest detections were reported in farmland way down south in Hainan province. Generally, high concentrations seem concentrated in the southern tropical regions. Agricultural soils in the south tend to have higher average concentrations than the north. Provinces like Fujian, Yunnan, Guangdong often report high median concentrations. This could be linked to the warmer, wetter climates, more pest pressure, leading to more pesticide use.
Is there one particular neonicotinoid that shows up most often in soils?
Yes. Imidacloprid IMI is the most widely detected one in most soil samples across China. That's likely because it's less water-soluble than some others, so it doesn't wash away as easily, and it binds pretty strongly to soil particles. Detection rates for IMI are particularly high in major grain-producing areas. And interestingly, when looking at total NEO residues, Zhejiang province reported higher averages, with IMI being a big chunk of that, even comparing different land uses.
Yeah, how does land use affect soil levels? Farmland versus parks, for instance.
Well, farmland generally shows the highest concentrations. But, maybe surprisingly, greenhouses can have much higher levels than open-air orchards, parks, or residential areas, probably due to the intensive frequent applications in that controlled environment. Vegetable fields in the Pearl River Delta had the highest median levels in some studies, and soil type matters too. Clay and organic matter tend to make them persist longer. Adsorption is stronger in some soil types than others, and the red soils common in the south might allow more leaching, more movement.
Okay, makes sense. Finally, the atmosphere. We don't often think of insecticides as major air pollutants. What does the research say about NEOs in the air in China?
Right, they have relatively low volatility, meaning they don't easily turn into gas, so they're mostly found in the air as particulate matter, tiny solid particles or droplets. But the research highlights that agricultural areas near pneumatic seeders, those machines for planting treated seeds, can have extremely high air concentrations during planting, sometimes even higher than nearby urban areas, just from the dust kicked up. Urban air surveys in major cities also found them, with Nanjing reporting the highest levels. IMI and acetamiprid were dominant there, likely from lawn care and maybe indoor pest control. There's even some evidence suggesting an upward trend in air concentrations in certain places, possibly linked to more household pesticide products being registered and used.
So planting season dust, city lawn treatments, maybe even inside homes, they're getting into the air too. This paints a really comprehensive picture of their presence: water, soil, air. Now, the critical question: what are the effects of all this contamination on living organisms? What are the ecological risks?
Yeah, that's the crucial part. The research clearly shows NEOs are being widely detected in organisms, aquatic invertebrates, insects, fish, and exposure can lead to a whole range of detrimental effects. from the individual level right up to impacting communities, leading to significant ecological risks.
Right.
Generally speaking, imidacloprid, IMI, often shows the highest toxicity across a broad range of non-target organisms. The lethal concentration needed tends to rise as you go up the food chain from insects towards mammals.
Let's break that down. What about fish? They're key to ecosystems and aquaculture in China. What are the findings there?
Studies using zebrafish, a common model organism, show sublethal effects. Even at levels not immediately deadly, exposure can cause things like oxidative stress, DNA damage, and altered metabolism. Other neos like THIM, THID, and NIT also cause similar issues. IMIs seem to cause the most DNA damage in the studies reviewed. What's really concerning is that even environmentally relevant low concentrations can cause harm. Low levels of THIM, for example, led to bioaccumulation, hyperactivity, changes in social behavior, memory loss in zebrafish, making them more vulnerable to predators. Low THIM also increased mortality and deformities in some rare minnow species and affected gene expression. Plus, combinations with other insecticides can sometimes make things worse, enhance the toxicity. The research even mentions the big decline in fishery resources in the Yangtze River, suggesting neo-pollution is a contributing factor to habitat deterioration there.
That's deeply concerning, especially for such a vital river system. What about birds? We hear a lot about impacts elsewhere. What's the picture in China?
Well, while bird population declines have been linked to neos elsewhere, there aren't really official China-specific statistics on that yet. But the potential is there. Main effects are physiological and reproductive harm from eating contaminated insects or, importantly, treated seeds. Birds tend to metabolize these compounds quite quickly, which might make them seem less toxic short-term. But there's a catch. Some neos, like THIM, get metabolized into other neos, like clothianidin, which is also toxic, so there could be cumulative or delayed effects. Effects can also vary by individual bird factors, but studies show exposure can reduce feeding, movement, even cause migration delays. And a place like Poyang Lake, a major wintering ground for water birds on a key migration route, is known to be contaminated. So definitely need more research on seed-eating and migratory birds there.
And, of course, the bees. Critical pollinators. What does the research say about effects on bees in China?
Absolutely critical. The main species in China are the European honeybee, Apis mellifera, and the eastern honeybee, Apis cerana. Mellifera might get higher exposure in some farm settings. Sensitivity varies, though. Between species, even within species, genetics, age, temperature all play a role. But generally, toxicity tends to rank something like clothianidin, thiamethoxam, imidacloprid, dinotiferin, nitenpyram asaniprid, CLO being the most toxic. Even low sublethal doses have effects. Low THIM can mess up the homing ability of Apis cerana, making it hard to get back to the hive. IMI can reduce their ability to avoid predators. ACE affects larval development and shortens adult lifespan. It's important to remember, as the research notes, bee decline is complex. Multiple stressors are involved, not just neos. And while China has banned some highly toxic pesticides, it doesn't yet have specific policies targeting neos like the EU or Canada do.
Right, a complex picture for bees. Finally, what about other aquatic life, like invertebrates, the base of many aquatic food webs?
They seem to be among the most vulnerable, especially aquatic insects like Chironomus dilutus, a type of midge larvae. The research indicates that predicted ecological risk thresholds for neos are frequently exceeded in China's surface waters, Pearl River, Bohai Sea, Yangtze River included. This suggests a significant potential for both acute, like short-term high dose, and chronic long-term low dose toxicity to a wide range of aquatic invertebrates. Areas like Beijing and that Qilu Lake Basin are particularly likely facing acute toxicity levels based on the measured concentrations. It really suggests a considerable potential for harm at the base of the aquatic ecosystem.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive really reveals a complex and pretty concerning picture of neonicotinoid presence throughout China's environment. From the fields feeding the nation to the parks in its cities, these insecticides are just pervasive. And the research clearly points to significant potential ecological risks, particularly, it sounds like, in the aquatic environment.
Indeed. And the regional differences in contamination driven by farming practices and urbanization, they're really striking. It definitely highlights the need for monitoring and maybe mitigation strategies that are tailored to specific regions within China. Plus, the fact that even those low environmentally relevant concentrations can have significant behavioral and physiological impacts on organisms like fish and bees, that's particularly noteworthy. Raises serious questions about long-term ecosystem health.
It really does. Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listener. Considering this widespread use, the persistence of these compounds, what further steps do you think are really necessary? How do we better understand and manage their environmental impact, both in China and, well, globally? Is it more research into long-term effects, stricter regulations perhaps, or a bigger push towards developing and using safer alternatives?
Those are absolutely the key questions. I mean, definitely enhanced monitoring, especially where we lack data, is crucial. More research on those long-term cumulative effects, especially how these chemicals interact with other stressors in the environment. And yes, without a doubt, exploring and actively promoting integrated pest management, prioritizing ecological health, and adopting safer alternatives. That seems paramount to mitigating these risks.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this overview has given you some valuable insights into this really important and complex environmental issue, and maybe spark some further curiosity to explore the original research yourself. Definitely something to keep thinking about.